Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for waiting. We'd like to begin plenary session number 1. First, I would like to introduce the participants. First, Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biodiversity, Elizabeth Maruma-Mrema. And IGES President, Takeuchi Kazuhiko. And IGES Biodiversity and Forestry Program Director, Andre Mada, will serve as the MC.
Dr. Mada, thank you very much.
Welcome everyone to this session of the ISAP 21 Plenary. We will be exploring in this session how to create the conditions to reduce biodiversity loss. Biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. Something like 8 million species, most of which are undescribed by science so far, made up of countless genetic combinations and composing countless ecosystems. And they're being lost at a rate which is unprecedented in certainly in human history and for the past few million years. And for the past few decades, the international community has been doing its best to address this loss, but unfortunately with very limited success. At the same time, we have achieved enormous advances in human development and the indicators of human development. Poverty, for example, has improved drastically over the past 20 years. Life expectancy continues to increase, and our ability to be resilient against even natural disasters has increased vastly. But we still struggle to achieve these environmental goals. Next year in May, at the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the CBD, a new framework will be agreed upon by the parties to the CBD on how to address the ongoing loss of biodiversity. And what we want to talk about in this session, in the context of that Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, is how can we do things differently to make them work this time, to turn them around during this decade that we've just begun. And to help us answer these questions, we're joined by two distinguished guests. Firstly, our President, Kazuhiko Takeuchi, who needs hardly any introduction. And then before we get to Professor Takeuchi, we have a video message, as mentioned by the moderator, by the Executive Secretary of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, Elizabeth Maruma-Mrema.
Professor Takeuchi, President of the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies, distinguished guests and speakers, ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you all. It is my great pleasure to speak to you today in what is now considered the decisive decade. It is critical that we make a call to all governments and stakeholders to work together using integrated approaches to align our vision, our agenda, and our actions for the benefit of the people and of the planet. Arising from the Earth Summit, 30 years ago, the Rio Conventions were adopted as essential instruments for sustainable development to safeguard the natural world and to ensure the future of humanity. Issues of climate change, biodiversity, and desertification are intimately linked, and coordinated approaches to the implementation of the objectives of the conventions are now needed more than ever before. Unprecedented changes in climate and loss of biodiversity driven by human activities are threatening nature, livelihood, and human well-being around the world. Climate and biodiversity challenges are both driven by economic activities and mutually reinforce one another. To tackle these challenges, we must use integrated, holistic approaches towards transformative changes and address these interlinked crises together, leveraging the opportunity of the proximity of the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity and the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Moreover, the period 2021 to 2030 has been named as the period of action for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. It is hoped that through the action, the decade will succeed to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystem for the sake of nature, but also for the key role that nature plays in addressing poverty and combating climate change. At part 1 of the Convention's Conference of the Parties 15, held in October, the Kunming Declaration was adopted by more than 100 parties to the Convention. These parties committed to develop, adopt, and implement an effective post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to impede biodiversity loss, support its recovery by 2030, and realize the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. The Kunming Declaration addresses critical elements required for the successful implementation of the new biodiversity framework. These include mainstreaming of biodiversity across all decision-making, recognizing the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, and strengthening the rule of law. The post-2020 framework will build upon the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020, agreed in Aichi, Nagoya, Japan in 2010, applying lessons learned from its implementation during the last decade. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will include necessary provisions for its implementation, in addition to mechanisms for monitoring, reporting, and review. The adoption of the Kunming Declaration is a clear indication of the worldwide political support for the level of ambition that needs to be reflected in the post-2020 framework. Moreover, the implementation of the framework will contribute directly to the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the land degradation neutrality targets. In addition, at part 1 of the Conference of the Parties 15, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the investment of approximately $233 million to establish the Kunming Biodiversity Fund to support the implementation of the new framework. The government of Japan also pledged to extend the Japan Biodiversity Fund by $17 million to continue its support to developing countries for the review and implementation of their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and to strengthen their capacity to implement the convention. In addition, the Global Environmental Facility, in partnership with the UN Development Programme and the UN Environment Programme, also announced their commitment to fast-track immediate financial and technical support for developing countries to implement the framework with no delays when it is adopted. Furthermore, the lead-up to the Conference of the Parties 15, we saw the launch of the numerous commitments for biodiversity restoration. These include the commitment of 75 financial institutions worth a collective 12 trillion euros in assets to protect and restore biodiversity through their activities and investments. The Green Climate Fund investing close to $9 billion to restore ecosystems, and $5 billion pledge over the next 10 years from 9 philanthropic organizations focusing on biodiversity. Overall, it was a very successful Conference of the Parties session, bearing fruitful outcomes for the future of biodiversity restoration. Post-2020 framework must be both ambitious, realistic, and achievable, taking real action on all drivers of biodiversity loss. The framework will be adopted at part 2 of the Conference of the Parties 15 in May 2022, following further formal negotiations at the resumed sessions of the Convention's subsidiary bodies meetings, as well as the open-ended working group on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to be held in person in Geneva, Switzerland in January 2022. The success of Post-2020 Framework will depend on the implementation of the objectives of all related international organizations and conventions, including the Rio Conventions, and will require integrated whole of government, whole of society approaches at national level. The good news is that we do see an increase in the recognition of the need to increase synergies among the Rio Conventions. Very recently, during the Conference of the Parties 26, the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, biodiversity and nature were prominent in the discussions more than ever before at a climate change conference. Key announcements that address biodiversity included a declaration to end deforestation, a statement by multilateral development banks regarding their movement towards nature-positive policies and outcomes, as well as the focus on biodiversity in hundreds of para events, workshops, and activities during the conference. The final text of the Glasgow Climate Pact noted the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems, including in forests, the ocean, and cryosphere, and the protection of biodiversity when taking action to address climate change. The text also emphasized the importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystems to achieve the Paris Agreement temperature goal, including through forests and other terrestrial and marine ecosystems acting as sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases and by protecting biodiversity. Achievement of the goals and targets of the Post-2020 framework will also rely on essential actions taken by all stakeholders and all of society. This includes indigenous peoples and local communities, non-governmental organizations, businesses, women's organizations, youth, academia and research, and subnational and local governments, among others. Strengthened capacity building and development of all stakeholders, technical and scientific cooperation, the transfer of appropriate technologies, innovations, and knowledge sharing will be equally important to enable collective action at scale. The decisive decade towards integrated solutions to climate, biodiversity, and other planetary challenges will therefore require collective, complementary, and holistic efforts across government, stakeholders, and all of society, as well as maximizing opportunities across multilateral agreements in order to chart a path to a more sustainable future. Let us work together as a global community to provide integrated solutions that offer multiple benefits for people and the planet. Thank you.
Very grateful to the Executive Secretary for that message. Professor Takeuchi, she mentioned in her talk integrated solutions, and this is something that you've spoken about quite a lot in the past before, and you've also spoken about localized solutions. Yeah. Could I ask you for two questions? The first one is, what is meant by integrated solutions, and what are meant by localized solutions?
First, let me explain about the necessity of integrating the discussions on biodiversity and how we could localize them. Let me start by explaining my experience when we started to revise the biodiversity strategy action plan after the adoption of COP10 Aichi Biodiversity Target. During the process of revising the strategy, we had a serious experience of the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunamis. And we then recognize that biodiversity is on the one side, the blessing to our society, but at the same time, it could be a threat to the human life and our society. And therefore, the biodiversity is something like both sides of coin. So we cannot extract only the positive aspects, but we also need to consider about the negative aspect of biodiversity. And living in harmony with nature is exactly, we are living both in the blessing and threat of nature. And this idea could bring us a new discussion on ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, or currently we are saying the nature-based solution. And therefore, the integrated approach is very, very important. And second point that I would like to emphasize is that compared with the climate change, biodiversity is not so popular to the people. And people are not recognizing the importance of the biodiversity, although they are fully utilizing and getting the benefits from biodiversity, including the medicine, the food, and many other issues. And also we could include recreation and cultural value of the biodiversity and so on. So we should mainstream the biodiversity by discussing with the society. And therefore, the integrated approach and localizing approach is very, very important to mainstreaming the biodiversity in our society. And the third point I'd like to share with you is that in order to achieve the biodiversity goal, either the Aichi target or Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework, it is not so easy. Not only the international organization can achieve this goal, also the national government, only the national government cannot achieve this goal. Private sectors, NGOs, academic communities, women's groups, many other youth need to be collectively started to transform our society. And therefore, it is very important to take an integrated approach as well as the localizing approach. And I think that these are the major reasons that I am insisting the importance of taking this approach in biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps you've already answered this question to a large extent, but I also wanted to, just as a follow-up, ask you, what makes integrated solutions and local solutions better than other possibilities, better than doing things separately or at a non-localized level?
Yes, as already Elizabeth mentioned in her speech, it is quite timely that COP26 started to mention about the biodiversity. And the Biodiversity Convention, the COP will be held in, was held and will be held in Kunming. We discuss about the biodiversity, but in relation with the climate change. And we have the SDGs. Under the umbrella of SDGs, we are now aiming to integrate it, rather fragmented discussions. You can recall that in 1992 in Rio, Convention on Climate Change, Convention on Biodiversity, Convention on Desertification were born at the same time. Though these conventions are called the sister conventions, but they have their own conference of parties, they have their own the secretariat, and they have their own scientific community who support the discussion. And it is not appropriate. And therefore, under the umbrella of the SDGs, we need to integrate these rather fragmented discussions. And we are fortunate that 2019, we could have a very good discussion on the synergy between climate change and SDGs. And at that time, during the conference, I emphasized the importance of adding other aspects, including climate change and disaster risk reduction. Now is the time for us to integrate these rather fragmented discussions. And we are very fortunate, but very recently, IPCC and EPBES published the joint report, how they could create the complementary situation between the two. And I just is very fortunate that we could translate this report into Japanese. And therefore, we are very happy that this integration on the global scale just started in order to strengthen the link among the different discussions, including the scientific community's integration. And also, in our national policy, I was a chair of the Central Environment Council, responsible for the drafting of the 5th Basic Environment Plan. And we proposed a regional circulating and ecological sphere, which try to integrate decarbonized society, resource circulation society, and society in harmony with nature, which aims to localize the integration of the global challenges as indicated by individual conventions and also the Sustainable Development Goals. And after or post COVID-19, green recovery is now we are discussing, and this needs to address the decentralized but yet connected society need to be established. And we are very fortunate that we are conducting lots of research works jointly with the Ministry of the Environment, how we could really materialize these ideas, localizing SDGs with the concept of CES. And not only in Japan, we are trying to expand our collaboration with the other part of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Takuchi. I also like how you illustrated the connection between the integration and the localized aspects. Thank you very much. So I will just move to the podium for the last final minutes of this session. So 1 second. I'll just end off with a very short view on creating the conditions to reduce biodiversity loss through innovation, incentives, and incremental change. So Takuchi-sensei gave you a very interesting view of integration and localization. Those were really the two ideas there. Over here, the 3 ideas are innovation, incentives, and incremental change. Now, we need to increase efforts to halt biodiversity loss and maybe even reverse biodiversity loss. But we probably also need to look at how we address this problem, not just the quantity of efforts, but also the way that we are doing things. Now, luckily, we human beings are good at this. We're good at innovation. And there are several examples of this, including in our field. So ecosystem mapping, for example, is something which has seen huge improvements over the past few years. Hardly recognizable what we were doing 10 years ago compared to what we are doing now. Precision agriculture is another area where we're doing incredible things in technology that can help biodiversity. So by being extremely efficient with the way that we use land, we use less land for agriculture, which could spare more land for biodiversity. And agriculture is, of course, by far the biggest user of land and therefore the biggest threat to biodiversity. And then other innovations like lab-grown meat, for example, which is really only taking off now, but has the potential also to really make a very big difference. And then in other fields, complementary fields, like climate change and disaster risk reduction and various others, there are also incredible innovations which have accelerated the way that we are able to deal with our problems. And just one example there are the huge jumps that have been made in storage technology, battery storage technology in various different ways in different fields. So perhaps what we need is one thing that we need is more incentives to accelerate this innovation. And by the way, nature itself is an incredible source of innovation. I won't go into this topic because it's a whole field by itself, But that gecko foot that you can see there is one example of how human beings have copied nature. And there are more than 13,000 patents that have been taken out on nature-based designs, more than 10,000 scientific papers that have been written on specific designs. So I wish I could talk about that a bit more, but let me move on to the final slide. This is just to bring the issue of incremental change into it. So you've all, I'm sure, heard of transformative change. This is a term that is not just environmental circles, but generally has been more and more common these days. But I don't think that many people know what is meant by transformative change. And it's very often thought of as a process. And I think it's potentially more useful to think about transformative change as an outcome rather than a process. But in order to get to an outcome, you still need a process. And perhaps the process towards transformative change is incremental change. And innovation is something that moves incrementally. And I think that this is how innovation comes into the whole picture. So you can see on this very simple graphic here how we sort of move along in small increments, sometimes going forward, sometimes going backwards, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing. But then if we keep at it, if we continue trying, then eventually we hit a point where, like with that little explosion there, where innovation explodes and produces solutions that really can make a very big difference, these sort of breakthroughs. So perhaps we need to provide the conditions or improve the conditions to achieve transformative change by incentivizing innovation and allowing it to progress incrementally like this. So these are just a few of the perspectives that we might want to think about over this coming decade, this very important decade for biodiversity and for other aspects of the environment. And I hope that our perspectives on these things have been useful and have given you some food for thought. Thank you very much.
ご登壇者の皆様、ありがとうございました。以上で、
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. With this, we would like to end plenary session number 1.